From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Thanks for listening. Coming up today during our first half hour, K-State's Mike Brouk and Jaymelynn Farney will discuss preparing for and managing silage harvest for beef cattle feeding. In the coming weeks, they'll look at options for putting up silage and what needs to be considered as far as storage alternatives. They'll also talk about salvaging a poor-doing corn crop as silage and the harvest considerations associated with that. Also today, we'll have this week's horticulture segment. K-State's Gregg Eyestone discusses various diseases that may now be showing up on landscape ornamentals and garden vegetable plants. He promotes cultural management as the best response to most of these pathogens. That and more right here on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today, and welcome. Well, we're still well ahead of the normal time when you livestock producers would be putting up silage for feeding later on in the year. However, planning now for silage production has value, and in the case of salvaging a failed row crop as silage, the lead time is even shorter. A recent podcast conducted by K-State Beef Systems Specialist Jaymelynn Farney addressed several key points on silage production preparation. And Jaymelynn tapped the considerable knowledge of a regular contributor to our broadcast, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk. Mike, very well versed in forage quality and preservation. Here's Jaymelynn.
We're wanting to kind of get a head start on thinking about your silage making, because this isn't something that you could just walk out the door one day and say, hey, I think I'm going to put up silage to feed my cattle. What are some of the main points to harvesting the best quality silage that you can?
So I guess key points, I would look at them as far as silage storage and preservation. One of the first things I look at is making sure that we have the right storage facility, and one that's really sized to the amount of silage that we're going to be feeding to our animals on a daily basis. And we have a smaller herd, we need a smaller face. If we have a larger herd, we can have a larger face, but we can determine how much feed we want to take out of that silo every day and make sure that we can move back in that silage roughly about a foot every day to keep that face fresh, but also to prevent loss of dry matter out of the face. So that's the first thing that I think about. And then as we start thinking more about the harvest, it's really the whole plant moisture, and it really doesn't make any difference whether we're harvesting a haylage crop or we're harvesting corn silage, making sure that we have adequate moisture so that we will have a good fermentation. Not too much moisture, but adequate. So if we can hit about 35% dry matter, that is an ideal both for haylages as well as corn silage. Although a lot of times with haylage, we'll go just a little bit drier, so we might hit closer to 40% dry matter on those. But again, if you can hit that 35, you're in a good sweet spot, if you will. That would apply to sorghum silage as well. So making sure we got the crop at the right moisture, and then we begin our harvest process. Once we start harvesting, we need to make sure that we can get adequate packing. We need to exclude the oxygen from that silage mass, because that will reduce the amount of heating that we have and cell respiration until the silage acids can rise to a level that we have a drop in pH to preserve that silage mass. So being able to fill quickly, ideally, it'd be nice to be able to fill a silo within a day. I know on smaller farms that may not be possible, but we need to really fill things as quickly as we can. On larger farms where we're putting up maybe thousands of tons of silage, a very large pile, we'll cover a portion of that pile that we finished every day. So getting that cover on quickly is very important after we finish the silage pile or the bunker silo. Bags are an advantage in that respect because basically we preserve it as we put it in as far as keeping oxygen away from it. So makes a pretty big difference there. Once we get it in, get it covered quick. Hopefully you're using an inoculant as you chop the silage, and that should be applied at the chopper. Is very important to do that. And then just use good feeding management as you feed that out so that you're keeping all the silage that you knock down each day cleaned up and fed. We don't have silage sitting on the pad overnight or for a few days that starts secondary fermentation and heating and becomes a lower quality forage for us.
Of those different storage methods, is there really a best method of storage, or is it just very operational specific?
Well, I think that really comes down to what is the number of animals that you're going to be feeding every day, or how much silage do you need to remove from that phase. The bags, even though they represent an annual expense for us and they do take up a little bit of space, but they actually give us a very small face, and we can easily move maybe as much as 2 or 3 feet back in each of those bags each day as we feed our herds. So that's really ideal. Start to get to larger size herds and we're feeding more corn silage, then the bunker or drive over piles become maybe something that fits our operation better. And as you look at bunkers and you look at drive over piles, you'll find that it's more cost effective when you look at the cost per ton of silage preserved. But if those are not sized correctly, we can actually get a lot of spoilage due to secondary fermentation on that face. So some of what we save maybe when we put it up, we end up losing when we try to feed it out. So again, is there one single best method? Well, if you want the very, very best silage, you would look at probably some sort of airtight storage structure, but the cost of that probably be a little bit prohibitive for most of our livestock operations. So again, for smaller herds, probably consider using the bags as you get larger herd size and larger number of animals that you're feeding. Drive over piles and bunkers are generally going to be more economical than the bags.
And, when you were talking about your storage and the feeding part, you kept talking about, I think you said you want to feed at least a foot of that face a day. So as you're planning that in regards to your storage size, how does a producer go about determining whether they need to use the bag system or whether a bunker and a cover could work?
So what I would look at there is if you take a 10-foot diameter bag, for example, those will generally hold about 1.25 tons of silage per foot. So you just look at the number of animals that you're feeding times the amount that you want to feed per day and see how that matches the bag. When you get bags and you start to do that calculation and you start to realize that you're going to be feeding 8, 10, 12 feet a bag a day, and if we're going to do this over many months, maybe 6, 8 months out of the year, that's probably the point at which we maybe need to start thinking about maybe we should use a drive over pile or a bunker, just because the amount of forage that we actually need every day to feed our animals. The bunkers or drive over piles maybe fit an operation where we're going to feed 365 days out of the year, as opposed to somebody that maybe has a small cow herd and we only feed silage 2-3 months out of the year. And again, depending on how many animals we're feeding and how much we're feeding, the bags might actually fit in better for us if we actually take a look at it that way.
And I love to feed silage. It's a very highly palatable, good feed. But what are some of the downsides to harvesting, storing, and or feeding silages?
It's actually fairly expensive to put up silage and to store it because of the dry matter losses that we can occur during that time. So if we don't do a good job of harvesting at the right moisture, getting that packed effectively, getting it covered, we don't do a good job with feeding management. When you look at total silage or dry matter loss, you can find farms that it can be 30-40% of the total dry matter that was actually harvested from the field. So now you have a situation where you've got probably some feed that's not very good quality, but you also have this extreme loss of dry matter. So if you don't take care of some of these key points, you will end up in a situation where feed might be a lot more expensive than what you thought it was going to be. Because a lot of times when we look at the cost of the silage, we just look at the cost of getting the silage into the bunker, plus the cost of the material that was packed into that bunker on that drive-over pile, and we don't really consider shrink as part of that. And unless you have some scales on your feeding wagons, you really don't realize how much silage that you're actually losing just because of the issues that you have with silage management.
Very good points. And, we always should take into account your cost of production and the cost of feeding.
So one of the things that I probably didn't cover adequately is when we're talking about putting this silage into either a bunker or into a drive-over pile, we need to make sure that we match our delivery rate of silage to the silo to be packed with the packing equipment that we have to make sure that we exclude the oxygen and get that silage density up there to the level that it really needs to be. So ideally, we're looking at, with corn silage, we're looking at a pack density of about 45 pounds per cubic foot. On an as-is basis, about 15 pounds of dry matter per cubic foot. So the amount of weight that we have on the tractors, and then also the amount of tons that we're delivering per hour and how long we're running those tractors are three factors that we really need to calculate.
We'll be back with more of this conversation featuring K-State's Mike Brouk and Jaymelynn Farney on the silage production game plan for cattle feeding. After this break, you're tuned to Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today continues now with more from that recent podcast on silage production for cattle feeding. Featured once again K-State animal scientists Mike Brouk and Jaymelynn Farney. And here they take up the prospect of utilizing a failed corn crop as silage in a cattle ration. Jaymelynn once more guides the discussion.
Right now there's certain parts of the country and even here in Kansas that there's certain areas where corn is looking pretty rough right now. What would you say to somebody looking to salvage those drought-stressed forages?
First thing I would say to producers, most of our producers probably have some sort of crop insurance on that crop. And many times you work with your adjusters and you can get a yield adjustment before you chop. Make sure you do that. If you chop it and then call the adjuster, that could be a problem. So make sure you get a grain yield estimate before you chop for insurance purposes. Now, when you look at salvaging a drought stretch crop, and typically it's corn silage that we're trying to salvage. A couple of things that I think are really important to keep in mind. Number one, in drought-stressed corn, the stalk actually holds a lot of moisture. So a lot of times as we are assessing when we need to start chopping, we need to be careful to make sure that we do not put up silage that's too wet. So when silages are less than 30% dry matter, typically we have more problems with Clostridia bacteria growing in those silage masses. And that Clostridia can be fairly detrimental to animals and animal performance. So we need to make sure we still get it put up at the right moisture. So drought-stressed crops, you need to really chop some of those plants ahead of time and run a dry matter on them so you understand what the actual dry matter of the crop is. It might actually be not as much dry matter there as what you think based on looking at the dry leaves on the crop because the stalk holds so much moisture. Second thing I'd encourage you to think about is we need to be concerned a little bit about what are nitrate levels in drought-stressed corn. A lot of times we fertilize fairly heavily for grain yield, a lot of nitrogen, and drought-stressed situation, we can get fairly high nitrate levels. Now, the good thing about this is the nitrates will be concentrated in the lower part of the stalk, particularly in the bottom, say, foot of the stalk. So we can high chop The problem with that is it's in a drought year, we're kind of like, well, I don't want to leave, too much behind in the field. And we tend to try to harvest a little bit lower. But if we do have nitrates in that material, we should test before we actually start chopping to see where our levels are. And if you are testing, make sure you test the lower portions of the plant more so than the upper portions. So, taking some samples of the bottom, say 10 inches or so of the plant across the field is probably the best way to actually assess whether or not you have a nitrate problem. And then you can take that into account as you decide, how high you should actually cut that corn in order to avoid some of those nitrates if that's needed. You also usually lose some of those nitrates as you go through the fermentation process in the silo, but not a guarantee. So if you have a nitrate problem going in, you probably for sure should be testing as you start to feed that crop to your animals. Make sure that you're not in a danger zone, or take appropriate measures to reduce the total nitrate intake of animals as you start through the feeding. Now, one of the things with drought-stressed forages is that we generally have to harvest fairly quickly. So we lose, because of the growing conditions that we have when we have a drought, things do dry out fairly quickly generally. So moisture goes away from the crop pretty quick. And as a result of that, you just need to be ready and have the capacity to chop quick enough to harvest those acres. Now, you're putting up very dry silages that are more than 40% dry matter, 50% dry matter. Those are difficult to pack into a bunker silo or pack into a dry over pile, at least to get a pack density that will preserve that feed well for you. You might consider putting those feeds in a bag. Probably would preserve better in a bag than they will in a dry over pile as you get to higher levels of dry matter than what we normally would have. I get a lot of questions about what is the value of these crops as well, because a lot of times may not be your own corn that you're chopping. You may be chopping a neighbor's corn or those sorts of things. So need to take into account the fact that we don't have grain generally. So if we have very little grain in it, essentially we're harvesting a forage crop, basically more similar to hay. So think about your prices a little bit, tonnages, and what kind of value the producer needs to be given for that stock that you're actually harvesting. Because a lot of times we have very little grain, so it's really a question of what is hay worth and those sorts of things, and how does that convert to a silage price for us.
And we always tag you, it seems like about every other year, to talk about salvaging drought-stressed corn. And one of the points you usually bring up that's interesting to me, we typically know what silage should cost per ton. Now, in drought seasons, especially if you're getting it custom harvest, depending on how your custom harvester charges you, you've mentioned that you might not have that $35 a ton of cost in your silage this time.
Yeah, one of the things that, the amount of fuel and time it takes to run across a field with a chopper, whether we're harvesting 25 tons to the acre or we harvesting 6-7 tons to the acre, the actual cost to run that machine actually doesn't change that much. The amount of fuel and stuff it takes to haul the silage away from the field does change. So one of the things that a lot of times custom harvesters will do in a drought situation is they may have kind of a flat charge per acre, essentially for the harvesting, rather than charging by the ton just so much of an acre, to make sure that they cover their cost of operation when we do have less silage that we're actually harvesting. So that's going to make your cost per ton go up, obviously, when you do something like that, but that is a reality. It's just more expensive to harvest on a per ton basis.
Why do we want to make sure we cover the silage pile? That's one thing that we One year we had a bunch of drought corn silage put up, and you drove by and saw all of them were uncovered. Is that a good or a bad management practice?
It's a situation that we get into. We sometimes we look at the cost of that cover, and we really don't understand how important that actually is. So when we leave these silage piles or bunkers uncovered, what happens is we have a lot of spoilage that occurs in actually the top 3 feet of the silage. So all of the rain and snow that we get, that soaks through that silage mass and leaches nutrients out, induces a lot of mold and other spoilage. So the spoilage in that top 3 feet, when it's uncovered, can run as high as 30-40% of the total amount of dry matter that we actually put into the silo. And a lot of that spoilage is going to be the top foot, but the spoilage actually really does extend down into that silage mass about 3 feet. Now, if you think about that, if I have a huge drive over pile, and let's say that, I've got 30 feet of silage piled in there. Well, that top 3 feet, that's a smaller percentage of the whole silage mass, as opposed to if I've only got a silage pile that's 8 foot high. Well, now the top 3 feet is a major portion of everything that we actually put in there. So if you don't use a cover, you're going to lose a lot of silage dry matter. You're going to lose a lot of the most digestible nutrients out of that top 3 feet of the silage. And your animals just aren't going to perform as well. In the worst case scenarios, we sometimes get some bacteria growing in there and molds growing in that mass that are actually detrimental to forage production. It's interesting. Dr. Bolson did a study here many years ago, and he demonstrated that with steers, if we feed 25% of a ration as spoiled silage, we'll actually decrease feed intake by about 7-8%. And as we go to 50% spoiled silage, it decreases even a higher percentage than that. It goes up to about 15%. So it really does, feeding this spoiled silage, we lose on 2 ends. We lose on the amount of dry matter that we've lost, but we also lose performance on the animals that we're feeding. So we have less feed to feed, and the feed that we do have remaining is of less value to the animals.
Dairy specialist Mike Brouk, along with beef systems specialist Jaymelynn Farney, both of K-State. Catch this entire podcast on the guidelines to beef silage production. The easiest route to that is to search for Dr. J's Beef. That's Dr. J's Beef. We'll be back. This is Agriculture Today. You are listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Eric Atkinson here as we continue on now with today's agricultural news headlines. These courtesy in part of DTN. The Senate Judiciary Committee held a hearing yesterday on companion legislation to the Farm Workforce Modernization Act of 2021 that passed the House of Representatives. The House bill does a number of things to include a cap on the number of year-round visas and provide a path to citizenship for immigrant workers. USDA Secretary Tom Vilsack testified at that hearing, saying that the future prosperity of American farms depends on their ability to hire workers. Here's more from the USDA's Rod Bain.
As lawmakers continued deliberation how best to address issues associated with farm labor and availability.
I'm here today simply to advocate on behalf of American agriculture and these workers to maintain the capacity of this great food and agriculture industry to continue to provide the benefits that we all enjoy in this country, and at the same time to provide the respect and dignity to the farm workers who are working so hard to make this system what it is today.
Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack Wednesday testifying before the Senate Judiciary Committee. The latest efforts to assure an adequate-sized ag workforce through modernization guest worker programs is a House bill approved earlier this year, now under Senate consideration. The Secretary noted some of the long-standing issues regarding farm labor that need resolution.
Availability of H-2A workers is always in question. Wage increases or decreases are fluctuating from year to year in an uncertain path. There is a cumbersome process involved. There are uneven worker protections separated from families.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Now, the H-2A program brought in about 275,000 workers in fiscal year 2020, nearly 166,000 in the first half of fiscal year 21. That's according to data from the U.S. Department of Labor. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, ranking member on the committee, said there are a number of steps that lawmakers can take to improve the ag labor situation. He said the H-2A guest worker program should be reformed to ensure that agriculture has access to a stable and legal workforce. The president of the National Pork Producers Council, Jen Sorensen, told the committee that the U.S. pork industry is facing a serious labor shortage, which is hurting both farms and processing plants. Sorensen said that pork industry wages average about $14.75 per hour, and that the U.S. pork industry is highly dependent on foreign-born employees. Well, crop herbicide injury episodes are surfacing across the Midwest and the South once again. Dicamba remains the primary source of complaints, although cases of 2,4-D injury are also being reported. That's according to state regulators telling that to DTN. In October of last year, the EPA granted those new labels and the 5-year registrations to 3 dicamba herbicides, XtendiMax, Ingenia, and Tavium, for use over the top on Xtend and Xtend Flex soybeans and cotton fields. The agency added some new rules, including national cutoff dates and the use of new volatility reduction agents in the tank. Yet regulators are watching complaints tick upward in some states, many from soybean fields with uniform cupping injury, suggesting volatilized dicamba is still at work. In the meantime, the EPA is watching from afar, telling DTN that the agency will work with its experts and state partners and will review dicamba injury data submitted to it by companies and regulators later in the year. They say if data demonstrate that the 2020 label control measures are insufficient, the EPA could take appropriate regulatory action to address unreasonable adverse effects, that according to the agency in its emailed statement. Now, many producers fear losing access to dicamba, which remains a crucial tool against herbicide-resistant weeds in the Midwest alongside 2,4-D and glufosinate. Weed control has been pretty good, particularly for growers who are timely, according to Joel DeJong, a field agronomist for Iowa State University. But he says for other producers, there is a growing frustration that the time is up for the industry to fix its off-target dicamba movement problem, which is now in its 5th year. DeJong said that he's hearing more and more comments and emails or texts from farmers that are tired of seeing beans cupped every year, he says, adding that they should just take that technology off the market in those farmers' opinions. Next up for you in Agriculture Today, this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. And with that, as always, is Greg Akagi. Greg?
Jennifer Simmelink is joining us. She serves as the coordinator for the Kansas Soil Health Alliance. And Jennifer, for those who may not be familiar with the Kansas Soil Health Alliance, tell us a bit about the organization.
The Kansas Soil Health Alliance was been spoke about for a couple years, but just formed in the last year. We are a farmer and rancher-led organization whose mission is simply to improve and protect Kansas soils. We intend to do this by having our farmers and ranchers helping other farmers and ranchers learn to take care of their soils.
Yeah, and this has really long-term effects on being able to protect that soil.
Improved soil health is going to help improve profitability and sustainability of your soil and your farm, and something that we're key to featuring. You know, many of us grow up, in your farm families. You want to leave that land better than how you got it for the next generation.
And one of the ways to do that is provide workshops that are taking place, and those are some of the brand new things that you're doing in the Kansas Soil Health Alliance.
We actually have our first field event that we are hosting together with No Till on the Plains, coming up on Tuesday, August 3rd. It'll be in Waukene. It's a free event, so we're really excited to offer that to anyone who's able to attend.
And it's going to be a cover crop field day type of event taking place?
We'll be spending half of the day indoors at the Trujillo County Fairgrounds 4-H building. And then the other half of the day will be at one of our board member, Bryce Custer's field. It's fully planted to a spring cover crop. While we're on the indoor session, we'll be including introductions and question and answer segment with the Kansas Soil Health Alliance board members. We'll have some grazing presentations, soil health, and rainfall simulator demonstrations from Candy Thomas, the NRCS Regional Soil Health Specialist. And when we head to the field portion of the day, attendees will be able to see side-by-side comparisons of soil structure and infiltration rates between some tilled ground, no-tilled ground, and undisturbed rangeland.
And Jennifer, if people want more information or to register for that event coming up on August 3rd, or just more information about the Kansas Soil Health Alliance, what's the best way they can do that?
kssoilhealth.org. To register for our event, we have a banner on the homepage that will take visitors directly to our field days listing on our soil health events calendar. And our website, we have an events calendar that features any soil health event we've been able to locate in Kansas or even in our surrounding states.
That is Jennifer Simmeling, coordinator with the Kansas Soil Health Alliance. She has been our guest on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Greg Akagi there. Many thanks to you, Greg. We'll return shortly. This is Agriculture Today. This Agriculture Today comes to a close with our weekly horticulture segment. Well, we're right here in the midst of midsummer, and about this time of the year in home landscapes, in gardens, we see a proliferation of disease troubles afflicting various plants, and we want to talk a few of those over and find out what, if anything, should be done about those conditions now. Gregg Eyestone has joined us. He's the Riley County Extension Horticulture Agent. When we think of the recent moisture that is probably linked to this, we would understand why all these diseases pop at once, Greg.
Yeah, it's pretty common to, at this time of the year, have some diseases show up. It's maybe a good thing. That means we've had some moisture, hopefully, and so that's a catch that we have to pay. If we get some natural rainfall, you're likely to trigger off some disease issues, particularly when we have lots of humidity and high temperatures, which is common this time of the year.
Let's walk through a few examples then and start with landscape ornamentals. Roses, for one, seem to be particularly prone to disease.
Yeah, so some diseases are more problematic than others, and I would say the black spot on our roses is one. We've tried to grow varieties that are more resistant to that, but there's some good old-fashioned roses, if you will, and that do have inkling to get that quite a bit, and it's a season-long issue, and so we have to manage that throughout the whole growing season, and reducing air pockets that create the humidity. We want to try and dry those out, and we do a lot of this through our cultural practices of proper watering, which would mean water probably early in the day so that those leaf tissues, if they get wet, can dry out so we don't have that humidity, that moisture throughout the day, and that's what diseases like is humidity and moisture availability for them.
In fact, we're going to emphasize cultural management, which is really the first line of defense here.
It is, and so you could start with varieties that are less prone to some of these issues, but sometimes we inherit plants and we have to work with what we have. And so doing the gardening practices the best we can, the proper pruning to get airflow through the plant, that's going to help. Watering, again, we mentioned just wetting the root zone probably once a week. So that reduces the amount of humidity around them. So your issues really get into when we have rain or irrigation practices that are on a very routine basis every other day, something like that every day. You're really increasing your potential to have problems. So we want to get a good root soaking for the root system to keep the plant turgid and cooled through this time frame, but let it dry out again so that the disease cycle is broken and you get just a good plant health.
And this is true beyond just roses. Peonies really show disease rather prolifically this time of the year, so this all applies as well.
It does. So doing our gardening practices the best we can is really our first or our most important aspect we can for good plant health, whether it be disease or some insect pressures or keeping the weeds down. So these are things we do as gardeners to make our plants as healthy as possible.
Staying with the landscape for the moment, Greg, do trees deal with any kind of disease pressure at all here in the throes of summer?
There can be a few. One of our most common and famous, the cedar apple rust or cedar hawthorn rust. There's different host plants. And so this time of the year, it's not as visual, but it does take the partnership of both plants to make that disease cycle function. And so right now, you're probably not going to notice, but during a rain event or some irrigation practices, high humidities, the spores that have infected our apple trees, our hawthorns, our pears, are sporulating and going back to the juniper plants. And so typically you don't see anything, but it does occur. Those spores usually take 2 years to really develop on the junipers, so next year you won't really see them probably as they develop, but the following year they will get larger, and then we have that rain event in the springtime, and you really see the cedars turning orange, if you will, and then it's going back to the other host's plant.
For those who really don't like those galls on their cedars, though, really not much that they can do about this.
There's not a lot. I mean, you could put down a preventative spray on your cedar trees if you think it's going to be a heavy season and worth the effort to do that. Generally, I don't know. There may be somebody who does that. I'm not aware of anybody that would, but you can eliminate some of the disease pressure by doing that. Also, sanitation we talk about a lot that we're particularly on those peonies we talked about, cleaning those up at the end of the season, which would be anywhere from mid-August on. You can take those leaf tissues and dispose of those. Pulling leaves off that are infected or raking up leaves that have fallen, those are things that you can do to help maybe at least psychologically make you feel better. I don't know if it'll be a real deterrent because diseases are there. They've been around forever. They always will be. So, but you can do some cultural practices if you'd like to.
In our remaining time, moving briefly here to the vegetable garden and the prime crops that seem to, again, exhibit disease, tomatoes, melon crops, cucumbers at times. Once more, good care to assure they're under the least stress possible seems to be the ticket here.
That is. I mean, you always want to start with that. So your watering practices, just wetting the root zone, doing it early in the day so the leaf tissues can dry out. There are some preventative fungicides. Again, we talk preventative. There's not really too good of curative solutions out there. There are a few. But generally, we're trying to prevent those leaf tissues from being infected with a coating of a product if you want to. And once you get it, it's there, so it's not going to go away, but you can maybe prevent some of the new tissues from getting it. Some people may not like hot and dry summers, but there's a lot less disease issues with those. So you can do your irrigation if you have the capacity to do that and may get away from some of these issues. Again, airflow is about the only thing you can do. I don't know if you want to stick a fan out in your garden to get some airflow through there, but just a good circulation. So sometimes the planning, so some of those things you can think ahead, hopefully, and just get good gardening practices in.
Main message, though, here, Greg, is that instead of opting initially and first response with a fungicide treatment, cultural management will carry the day more often than not.
Right. You need to do all these things, use all the tools that you have, and we always want to start with good cultural practices to begin with. And hopefully the plants will be able to defend off. They have some natural resources there to help themselves, and they want to survive. And so sometimes we can get by with just doing some good gardening practices.
And be employing those throughout the growing season, of course, but especially now as we've still some summer stress to go. Greg, thank you for coming over.
My pleasure.
Riley County Extension Horticulture Agent Gregg Eyestone with us on this week's Horticulture segment. Our time's away once more. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.